May God be with you.
And with your spirit.
A proclamation of the Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, O Lord.
When Judas had left, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. And if God is glorified in him, God will glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. My children, I will be with you only a little while longer. I give you a new commandment: love one another. As I have loved you, so also should you love one another. This is how all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
I would like to invite you all into a little imagination exercise. Imagine that you are in a house, it's not yours, and there's no one home. The reasonable question that would come to mind would be, who lives here? Who lives here? And so in an attempt to answer that question, you might make some first impressions. You might notice that there are 3 bedrooms in the house. You might notice that in one of the bedrooms there's a crib. In another one there's a walker that an older person might use. You might have a first impression of how well off the residents of this home are economically, whether they seem to have a lot of money or be middle class or perhaps be poor. You might have a first impression of what kind of housekeepers there are here. Is the house neat and clean, or is it dusty and disheveled? You might have a sense of the aesthetics of the people who live there, saying to yourself, those are really ugly drapes, or what beautiful tile. Okay? So you might have a set of first impressions in this house. But then maybe you dig a little bit deeper, and since no one's home, you go and you open the closet door and you look at what's in the closet. And you can see clothes and shoes, and you can make a judgment. Are these men's clothes or women's clothes, children's clothes? Perhaps then, in addition to that, you go to the cupboards and open the cupboards and the refrigerator and see what kind of food and groceries there are. And maybe that gives you a clue as to the ethnicity of the people who live there. Perhaps you get a sense of, you take a deeper look at the art and the photos that might be on the walls. Maybe you notice the technologies. There's 3 TVs here and 2 computers. Or perhaps you notice the reading material that might be scattered throughout the house. Taking all these things into consideration, you don't know for sure the number of the people who live there, who they are, or what their names might be, but you have a reasonable guess as to who lives there, who lives here. Now let's take that imagination exercise and build on it and zoom out a little bit and ask the same question about the neighborhood. Who lives here? And do the same kind of first impressions and then deeper dive. And then move out a little bit further and ask the same questions about the city. Who lives here? And get your first impressions and take the deeper dive. And keep on going to the country and eventually to the world. The reason I'm inviting you into this imagination exercise is that I think today's scriptures offer to us 2 replies to the question, who lives here, at every one of these levels. The first reply comes from the book of Revelation, where the writer says he sees a new Jerusalem coming down from heaven, and then goes on to say something remarkable. God's dwelling is with the human race. God's dwelling is with the human race. There will be no more mourning or tears. The old order has passed away. So one answer that the scriptures offer today to who lives here at every one of these levels is God does. God's dwelling is with the human race. The gospel offers a slightly different version that amounts to kind of the same thing. When Jesus says to his disciples, "This is how all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. If you have love for one another the way I have loved you." So when we ask the question, who lives here at every one of these levels, when we see people who love one another as Christ loved his disciples, we can say, well, Jesus' disciples live here. And the scriptures are deliberately trying to portray for us a sense of hope when we ask that question, who lives here? Unfortunately, we know that God and Jesus' disciples aren't the only ones who live in our world, because we have way too much experience of human weakness and human sinfulness to say not everyone appears to love the way Jesus' disciples love, or in a way that's reflective of God's presence here. And yet, eyes and hearts of faith want to affirm that all three of these answers come together at the same time. God dwells here, Jesus' disciples dwell here, and weak and sinful people dwell here. All these people live here at all these levels. Sometimes we recognize who folks are because they group in clusters. So this might be a particularly noticeable group of people who love as Jesus loved. But more often than not, the answer to the question, who lives here, is perceived by contrast. So, for example, there is still mourning and death, but yet there is consolation and new life. Or we might confront situations that seem to be absolutely godless. God doesn't seem to be present here at all, and yet, in that very experience, something can well up in and around us that makes us mindful that indeed God's dwelling is with the human race. So, what might be some examples that illustrate who lives here at every one of these levels? Well, one cluster, I hope, would be the cluster of parishes and the people who belong to them, and perhaps parish schools, and maybe neighborhood high schools like VASJ, where at least in principle, people who populate those institutions and who interact with one another love one another as Christ loved his disciples. And so hopefully we can recognize disciples of Christ present in our midst, and in so doing recognize also that this is indeed God's dwelling, this segment of the human race. But more often than not, I think we perceive who lives here through contrast. So let me ask this question. Who lives in Ukraine and the surrounding countries? Who lives there? Well, we can certainly point to people who do not seem to be loving as Christ loved us. But how many images have we seen of people in Ukraine itself and in the surrounding countries caring for one another, taking people into their homes, welcoming amazing numbers of refugees, and perhaps without explicitly saying so, they are loving one another as Christ loved them. We can say at one and the same time, God's dwelling is with them. We can identify disciples live here, even as we can point to weak and sinful human beings as well. Another example. Recently, I began to read a book about the history of African worship in North America, right from the time the first slaves were brought over to North America. And they lived in horrendous conditions. And the slave masters did their best to keep them from being able to have significant relationships so that they couldn't have uprisings. And one of the ways they kept them apart was to not allow them to have any kind of worship except the white worship that was in their community. And in the middle of this kind of situation, I learned of a new term that I didn't know before, an invisible institution. Apparently, the first Africans who came to North America as slaves developed an underground church. It wasn't necessarily Christian from the get-go, but they got together to recognize with one another that God was with them. And they gave praise and thanks to this God being with them, and they named this God as one who would liberate them. Who lives here in this African community? God dwells with the human race. God dwells with them, even though there are weak and sinful people around them. I'm mindful of my experience at hospice right down the street, both as someone cared for and as a caregiver. I've often described being at the bedside of a loved one who is dying as the last place you want to be and the last place you don't want to be at the same time. You're on holy ground, and at one and the same time, there's a sense of God's dwelling is with the human race as these people who love as Christ loves us minister all around, even as we're at death's and suffering's doorstep. Who lives here? All three. I think about the folks who go to and who work at the Hunger Center and the experience of people who are involved there. Certainly significant hardship and suffering, some of that caused by human weakness and sinfulness, and yet there percolates up from those who work there and volunteer there and who receive that care the sense that God's dwelling is with the human race. And these are, in fact, some disciples of Christ. Even though they may not name it that way, they love it that way. And still one last example would be the church's commitment to its social justice mission. And in my article this week in the Bulletin, I've written about our microloan program and how for several years now we have been providing loans and supporting people who have tried to start businesses, struggle to do so, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so, but to support and encourage one another in the process. Where does God live? Who lives here in this social justice effort? I want to say God's dwelling is with the human race here. And there are indeed disciples of Christ who are loving as Christ loved us, even as people face challenges and weaknesses sometimes brought on by human suffering, by human sinfulness. As I was preparing these reflections, I had really the terrifying thought, what if someone stood in my house when I wasn't home and they asked themselves the question, who lives here? Who lives here? What would I be proud to have them see, and what would I hope they miss? And I think if we're honest, probably every one of us can wrestle with the terror of that kind of assessment. And yet, I think the answer that we are invited to give today is God's dwelling place is here. There is a disciple of Christ who lives here, even though perhaps weak and sinful. And as we go up each phase, from the neighborhood to the city, to the country, to the world, the scriptures today invite us to offer those same answers. These are intended at their foundation to be hopeful passages. The old order has passed away. The new order is not yet fully here, but it's emergent. We catch glimpses of it. And we do indeed have the blessing of encountering people who love as Christ has loved us.
care for each other. I have cared for you. Bear each other's burdens, bind each other's wounds, and so you will know my return. My friends, do you know what I have done for you? I have washed your feet with my hands. If I, your Lord, have knelt at your feet, you should do at each other's feet as I have done for you. Love one another as I have loved you. Care for each other, I have cared for you. Bear each other's burden,